Hello everyone, this is Ray from Team 3118A, and today I'm here to explain our Worlds robot because even though it didn't get very far at Worlds, it still has a lot of weird quirks and features that I think are worth sharing. So we're going to start off with the intake. We wanted a good balance between rigidity, sealing, and the drop-in intake for this one. So we have triangles up here to make sure that we have enough rigidity in the front. We also have this ram bar so that we make sure nothing bends. And to make sure that we have enough room for the drop-in intake, we have our motors on the outside and these cantilevered sprockets on high-strength shafts. These were really nice because they don't take up much room at all, and they're still pretty strong. We made these by drilling and tapping a couple of holes into the high-strength shaft, which is a lot of work, but ended up being really worth it because of how compact they are. Another feature on this intake is the giant wall gliders right here. These were mostly made to make sure that the profile of the robot stays outside the motors, so that even if we take a hit on the intake, it's definitely not going to bend the motor or anything, because we had a lot of that going on earlier in the season. And we just really wanted to make sure that we didn't lose that motor. That didn't happen at all at Worlds, which is really nice. Next, I guess, is the wedge. The wedge was basically a piece of polycarb that we bent in the brake, and it's really smooth and able to fit under other intakes, which is really nice. And it's backed by both this half cut and the ram bar, which made it extra rigid. It won't bend away from like other intakes when it takes a hit, or like hit the rollers, which is good. Another thing with this intake is how low it sits during possession. So as you can see, oh, that's not the right button. Even after it intakes, it sits at the exact same height as it is before it intakes. So that makes it harder to steal from when we do have possession. And also, even if our intake does get lifted up, the tribal does remain to an extent. It's all because of this slope down here. That is a piece of polycarb that's just rubber banded on, and it houses the tank and battery behind it, which makes them extra secure and very protected from hits. One kind of weird thing about this intake is that it's so low that it can actually push into the goal when when it has a tri-ball in it. So as you can see, it just kind of hits it straight on. And that wasn't really an issue because our driver is good enough to where he can just outtake every time, and that'll be fine. Moving on to the base, we decided to make it a 6-motor, 600 RPM base to really get those fast rolls both made and intercepted for rolls. We decided to run it on 2.75 all Omni wheels to get that extra traction for acceleration and to slide around defense without locking up as much. We tried to make this space as tight and fast as possible to keep the weight down and mobility high. So you can see that we have the thin 5-wide base here using the low strength gears. Another thing with the space is the mcMaster car spacers that we have, which let us have 600 RPM without bare shaft in the drive, which was a real issue before in a spin-up base that we did, the Asterisk drive. Yeah, so the 15/64 outer diameter spacers actually prevent that and fit between the rollers really nicely without hitting, because the CAD showed that the 1/4 inch outer diameter spacers actually hit the rollers whenever it's going to move, and this one doesn't at all, which is really nice. Also, even though these are metal steel, which sounds pretty heavy, it's actually kind of negligible because of how light and thin they are. I guess the only downside to these is that they have a pretty big internal diameter, which causes it to roll around on the shaft and make kind of a weird clicking noise, but that's also kind of sounds cool. Which probably the weirdest feature on our base is the plastic bearings that we made. So we decided to run 600 RPM drive, which has a lot of shafts and screws right up next to each other, which doesn't leave a lot of room for boxing. So you can see that we have pretty untraditional screw holes for the bearings, and that's because these are for custom cut plastic bearings that we made. They're polycarb squares that were cut on the router to fit inside the channel, which were stuffed with round inserts. And it opens up a lot more room for boxing with spacers because we don't really like boxing with caps nuts as much. And you can't really do that with normal bearing flats. And also these are a little bit lighter as well, which is kind of nice. So another thing that's kind of only tangentially related to the base is we wanted it to be as rigid as possible. The guideline for me, at least, was I wanted to be able to drive this robot off the table and still be able to drive it in a match. So we have triangles everywhere, both right here on the sled in the back, but also like towards the bottom braces down here and on the front corners that we didn't really use. That really makes sure that nothing bends. It's also all the way on the top structure and on the intake as well. Like up here you can kind of see that it's a little bit crazy with the triangles. We also have boxing on every structural joint and standoff skids to protect the gears, low strength gears, from bending away from the barrier whenever we're traversing, which involves a lot of drilling into standoff, which is a little bit weird. This overall, it made it like really beefy, 16.5 pounds, which did kind of hurt us in being able to traverse as easy or being able to hang, but it was still really nice to be able to, again, drive it off the table and still be able to take a match right up after that. And finally, for the base, we have the odometry pods. It's kind of hard to see from right here. So these are relatively normal high-resolution odometry pods. You can see that we have the 36:60 gear ratio going on so that we can have both a high resolution and stack the odom encoder on top of the wheel instead of next to it, which frees up a lot more space. And we also have odom retraction, as you can see right here. Right now it's out, so it means that the wheel can pivot down, but once this gets retracted, it's not able to do that anymore, so it doesn't hit the barrier. Another feature that I really liked on this robot, and some of the other ones that we built this season, is the diagonal brain. So with the diagonal brain, you can look at it pretty well from a high angle, whereas with the completely vertical brain, you kind of have to squat down to look at it straight on. And how we did this is by attaching the brain to a piece of angle bar and putting that on a high-strength pillow bearing and putting that on a diagonal standoff brace that we have right here for the triangular bracing. And what that does is it allows the brain to live on the triangular bracing. So it's all very light, and yeah, it just makes the brain really good for access and everything. I recommend you steal this design because it's really light again, and you get to see the brain from a high angle pretty well. Okay, moving on from the diagonal brain to the wings. These are really not that special, but other than the way that we mounted them, they're the high strength wings that are both for removal and push over, courtesy to Robocause 21417A. And they're semi-locking using the standoff joints that we have here, and on bent high strength shaft, which we just put in the vise and hammered until it was at the angle we wanted. I just copied these straight from the stage spot that we had because we didn't have enough time to make lighter wings. These are super heavy but kind of easy to mount because of the bend up front and the piston being inside the C-channel right here. Yeah, so these wing pistons are mounted on shaft collars inside the C-channel right here. And this is like really good for access, kind of bad for center of gravity. It opens up the wings even though it looks like a really unfavorable angle from up here because the pivot for the piston is from here to here instead of from the base of the piston to the head of the piston. It's to the pivot right here, which gave us a lot of weird leverage. So yeah, I also recommend that you steal this design as well. even though it looks a little bit off sometimes. It was really nice to have pistons on the outside of the robot and still be able to have them relatively protected by the wing as well. Yeah. So finally, we're gonna talk about the hang. The hang is really not that special. It's a 4-piston hang for B tier. The only really weird things we did is that we used it for the intake deploy, which strangely doesn't waste any air because of how we wired our solenoids. And another weird thing is the limit switch that we have right up here, and that makes it so that we can automate our climb to an extent and make it a little bit faster and more reliable, even though our driver was good enough to mostly hit the button before the limit switch most of the time. But as you can see, if I hit this limit switch, it goes down immediately, which is pretty nice. Alright, that's going to be about it for this video. Thanks for watching, and good luck in high stakes.